Hello and welcome to the Aetherdrift limited set re-review. I know the set has come and gone so fast, but I think this is kind of the new schedule. There's going to be basically a format every 2 months, so it's already time for me to do my re-review here. And yeah, I mean that's what I'm going to be doing in this video. I'm going over my set review. There's stuff I got right, stuff I got wrong, a lot of stuff I got wrong this time, so I'll be doing a deep dive on that aspect of things. Um, And I'm just going to be talking about cards and sort of how I feel about the format. It's a good way to close out the format. It's a good way to do some self-evaluation, see what we were, see how our perception matched up with reality. So we're going to start with some cards I got wrong. Air Response Unit is the first card that I want to highlight. Um, the thing about Air Response Unit is, and it's a personal failing of mine because I didn't really play a set with this many vehicles or like even close to this many vehicles previously. It's just really difficult to evaluate the opportunity cost of playing vehicles because again, you can't just put an infinite number of them in your deck. And this card, now part of it is this card doesn't do anything on ETB, but part of it is the decks where this card would have been at its best didn't really work, and it just didn't go in every deck, right? Like in theory, this card has reasonable stats. It has vigilance, it attacks and blocks. This should have behaved, in a lot of formats. Like if you printed this in a normal set, I think it behaves like performs a lot better than it did in this format, just because there were so many other vehicles you could have, and this one just wasn't really doing anything that those other ones weren't, and the other ones were really important, and you could only play so many vehicles, and this one just wasn't that important. So Um, yeah, and I mean, it just doesn't, it's a 3 mana spell, so you think you can get away with not having ETB. There was actually a real glut on threes in this format. It's going to be really interesting to go back to. Well, actually, I don't think we're going to be going back to normal Magic in the next set because it's a three-color format, so that's going to be interesting. Another extended vacation from two drops being the soup du jour here. This was not a two-drop centered format. It's the first one in a very, very long time, but still not slow enough for Air Response Unit to do anything. I actually think this would have been better in a faster format. Light Wheel Enhancements. So another card that I got wrong in my set review, and was wrong by more than I should ever be wrong, really, like in this direction. Um, Saying a card's going to be really strong and then having it be basically unplayable is pretty bad and should almost never happen. The reason that this card was not good is that it doesn't really help you reach max speed at all. It kind of looks like it does. It's like, oh, you put this on your creature, the creature's bigger, gets an attack in. And in theory, that's great, but it just doesn't really work out that way. And recasting this just didn't matter because your opponent could just not kill the creature that this was on, or like there's just so many ways around it. Um, and it just didn't like the all the creatures were green and enormous, so it didn't matter that you gave your creature +1/+1 because the 6/6 still blocks it in most cases. So it just kind of didn't really do anything, and as a result, it was sort of unplayable. This is sort of a card that highlights, how you can, when you look at cards in the past to try to do some evaluation of cards for a future set. This highlights the traps, right? Because Sentinel's Eyes. Now this card is probably just worse than Sentinel's Eyes in a vacuum in hindsight, but when it says speed on it, that's a set mechanic I believed a lot in speed, and speed kind of failed, which we'll get to in a bit. Um, this card just it shows why that school of thinking doesn't always work. Another card that sort of highlights that same thing is Ether Siphon. So, Ether Siphon is a card that I think in pretty much every set that wasn't this one, that's not 100% true, but it's kind of true that in pretty much every set that wasn't Aetherdrift, this card would have been unplayable. I rated it as being unplayable. I do think the idea of stapling a win condition to your draw engine is like milling out your opponent, stapling it to your draw engine actually is something I overlooked. It is something I underrated. But I do also think that the like My found another foundational point I didn't like was the double pip. Right, I didn't like a double pip 3 mana spell, and in this format it like didn't matter as much because you just didn't. Uh, it just didn't. That's not what the format was about, right? It wasn't about being super efficient and getting on board. I think in most formats, because it would just be really hard not to die if you play this on turn three in most formats. But in this format, it was so easy to stall the board out that you could just mill people every single time. Um, yeah, stock up. So stock up, similarly to Ether Siphon, is a card that I misevaluated because I just sort of said, hey, the pure card draw stuff doesn't work, and I think we've sort of been proven that that's just not true. It turns out divination wasn't about the fact that drawing two cards for one card was a bad rate. It was, the fact that sometimes those cards are lands, and in Stock Up's case, those cards are never cards you don't want, right? It basically never happens. There have been some instances in the format where I drew five and looked at four lands and a spell I didn't care about, and that has happened, but it's not a frequent occurrence with this card. And the fact that that is sort of a fail case that you remove with this is very powerful. Again, also the slow format helps, but I do think if you were to reprint Stock Up in like any format, it would probably just be really good. And I just whatever. I don't know if it would be this good. I think this is as good as you could really possibly do with it, but I think it would be a playable to decent card in every format. Intimidation Tactics. So I really liked this card pre-format because it interacts with a lot of things well. It exiles. There wasn't that much exile in the set. That level of relevancy could come up, but the problem with the this type of card is it's hard to like take early because again you'd rather just have like stuff that's on the board. Even in the set, you'd rather have something that was on the board. And the cycling mode just didn't really matter. Like cycling for three is just too much. It's just too expensive for it to be reasonable. You cycled Night Market more than you cycle this card, or at least I did. Um, and that's kind of the type of effect you were looking for with this. Is like, oh, it's going to be like Night Market. You can cycle it, but Night Market being on a land is just so much easier to fit into your deck than Intimidation Tactics, which is not. Um, when it worked, it was great, but it just didn't always get there. And I tend to overrate these style effects in general. Marauding Mako. This was a miss for me, and it's kind of a lesson in not over-indexing on like, hey, this card is like really sweet in one deck. You should rate it based on the performance in that one deck. I think that's just kind of a bad way to go about this. I got all excited about blue red. Blue red was fine, but not the best deck. And this card was good in blue red. But certainly just overhyping a card based on its value to one deck. A lesson to be learned here. Um, yeah, and I think just this card didn't perform as well, partially because again the format was a little bit slower and it just got bottled up a lot. There was just a lot of ways to bottle it up. So that's blue also being good and having several good bounce spells hurt this card a bit as well. And the final section on cards I got wrong, we talked about the other one vehicle earlier, but I wanted to talk about these three in particular as ones I got wrong. I didn't want to separate them out because it's basically the same argument for all of them. They all are very expensive vehicles that don't add to the board without a creature, need creatures like on the board very badly to do anything, even to like attack or whatever. And there's just not that valuable, and I overrated all of them considerably because they were like the size on the vehicles almost didn't matter because the Apocalypse run rate's a 6/5. It almost never attacked. I don't think I ever saw it attack. It did more blocking than I saw from attacking, and then like when you're Specifically, the runner having like a tap ability that means you're tapping your big vehicle down to do a thing was actually really bad. It would have been, I think, considerably better if you could have just had if it just cost one generic mana and you could only activate it once per turn. I think that would have been. I think I would have preferred that design. I understand why they went with this one because you could do it immediately, but I think I would have preferred that other design so you could still block and attack with your vehicle and use the ability in the same turn. That was just way too awkward. It just was too much of a hindrance. Mech cycle again. If you could get away with playing more vehicles in your deck, then mech cycle would have been good. But there just weren't enough vehicles that came with creatures to like crew them. There were a couple of them, but there weren't enough that the mech cycle was a feasible thing to be doing. Oh, there's another card I got wrong. I forgot about that. I had the Tarian. I wanted to give a shout out to Tarian. It turns out if you make a creature large enough, it will actually be good. The reason this card is good is partially because of the tutor for it as well. Finding this off your 2/4 for 4 curves right into it. That was a big part of why this was a success. Um, but yeah, the size does matter. Specifically, having 7 toughness was quite relevant. There were a couple of spells it avoided as a result of that, and I think if it didn't avoid those spells, it would have been a couple of points worse, a couple of percentage points worse, and that might have been enough for it to not be very strong. Also, green, the best color, so triple green wasn't as big of a deal as um, it can be in some formats. All right, on to the cards I did get right, of which there are 5. You notice I put like I don't know. There's a bunch of cards. I was looking through my set my original set review, and I was like, man, there are more misses than usual in this. This is like 60. It was like a 50-50 split of like cards. I was like, all right, I'm happy with that grade, and cards I was like, hey, didn't like that one. Usually it's closer to like, oh, 80% of these I'm like, that's okay, and then like 20% of them I'm like, this format it was like basically a coin flip whether I was even in the ballpark. So see if we can improve on that. I think the best format I had was MKM in terms of card evaluation. We'll have to whatever. We'll have to go check on that. I'd have to go give myself like a grade or whatever. Maybe it was Bloomborough actually. It might have been Bloomborough. I had some good takes in the Bloomborough one. But yeah, on to this card, Mutant Surveyor. The reason I highlighted this as a card I was right about is that I said in the set review and elsewhere that this would be the best of the cycle, and that proved to definitively be true. I don't think anybody's going to argue with me on that. I think this one was clearly the best one, and I got that right. It kind of just enabling its own attacks was really important with the threat of activation. Just was a really good way to enable speed. It actually might be one of the best speed enablers in the set, other than Pact Terror. But this one starts your engines and enables the speed, which there were very, very few things that did that. So this actually ended up being a somewhat relevant card in a lot of black decks, and you were pretty like reasonably happy to play it. So I got that one right. Hour of Victory. So there are still believers about Hour of Victory out there. There are people who really like this style of card. I am not one of them. It's a fine, like you can play it. Again, I have it in tier 4. It's not in tier 5. It's not unplayable. But for me, I just think people get so attached to, oh, hey, I can demonic tutor. Isn't that cool? That they kind of miss that like you're playing a 3 mana 2/2, which is really bad up front. And again, there are decks where this was fine, but it just kind of didn't really fit anywhere because like in a slow deck, it's going to have a hard time getting the speed on, and in a fast deck, you're playing a 3 mana 2/2. It's just kind of not. It doesn't really work. It just doesn't really work super well. So I just demonic tutor again. We saw demonic tutor in Strixhaven, and it was fine, but not. People draft demonic tutor like it's busted, and it's just okay. I mean, better than okay. It's just good. It's just a good card, but it's not like the be all end all of a format. And this card certainly was not that. Bounce Off. So another card I put in tier 3, sort of like an average card. I think it's the type of card that can get overlooked. But the first copy of Bounce Off was actually better than tier 3, I think, in most decks, because it's just so nice to have that 1 mana bounce effect. It slows your opponent down by such a wide margin really that you can really build up an advantage, especially when blue is like out carding your opponent. You're all about like drawing cards, which it was in this format. It really was like just try to get some cards and be ahead. And if you just got enough time to do that, you would win. So this card allowed you to do that very well, and it allowed you to blow people out tempo wise and do all that stuff for single blue, which was quite nice. Canyon Vaulter. So this ended up basically being a 2-mana 3/1, and I kind of rated it like it was going to be a 2-mana 3/1 with minor upside in my set review. I didn't love it, and that proved to be a correct take. Um, I kind of was right for the wrong reasons on this. I kind of thought that the other stuff with vehicles would be more impressive, but this was just not necessary to give your stuff flying. Usually your vehicles are pretty big and can attack well already, and a lot of the vehicles didn't actually want to attack. So, and some of them had fly already too. There were games where it mattered for sure, but I think it really did suffer from just dies to removal, blocked by 1/1s, doesn't really attack super well. The board stalls out, and this thing is theoretically supposed to help with board stalls, but in reality, it basically didn't do anything with the board stalls. So it was pretty bad. And the final card I got right, or set of cards right. I don't want to put all the lands up here, but it's these lands. They're all the same. Is this cycle of lands here, and I feel very good about my evaluation of these type of lands where they're lands that sacrifice late in the game for incremental value. That is not drawing a card, right? If the land sacrifices late in the game to draw you a card, it tends to be pretty good. If it sacrifices to make a creature that is not relevant, it tends to be pretty bad. That's sort of where we're at with these style of lands. I think we're going to continue to see going forward, and I feel confident with my ability to evaluate them as non-premium lands. Like we've also entered the play booster era where it's harder to get playables than it used to be. Like you just have 3 fewer cards that you're drafting in packs, and so your deck is you're going to have 3 fewer slots to choose from, which makes things difficult. It does. It makes the draft more difficult, and these kind of get squeezed a bit as a result. My overall rating of Aetherdrift is a 4 out of 10. That's low. That's a pretty low rating. I have given it this rating for a number of reasons. The first of which is that color balance is a problem. Green was too good, I think, and white was too bad. Obviously, as formats progress, color strength is less of a thing, right? You can draft more, and I know I never want to say that stuff is unplayable or whatnot because in pod stuff is different. But I think a good format is gonna be good in even in the arena best of one ladder, right? Good formats are good even there, and so I think this format being a slower format that also had a significant edge to being on the play, that's a recipe for disaster in my opinion because you kind of get the worst of both worlds. Where in some games you feel like, oh well, I just got run over and died, and in other games you're like, well, I built my deck to, you know, deal with some of the faster stuff, and then I got out control, and you kind of get into this rock paper scissors, and that happens in any format, so it's not unique to this format in particular. But I do think we kind of entered a place where it got to be too much. Like I just didn't love the gameplay of the format. I don't love board stalls. Like I don't like trying to fight through board stalls. I don't find that to be very fun or interesting. It leads to a lot of top decking wars at times, which again, not there is user error there, but it's not the style of game I like to play. I kind of like to be trying to maximize my limited number of resources instead of just get as many resources on the board as possible, which is kind of what this format was like. This format was like get as much stuff on the board, like just have as many things in play as possible, and then eventually like attack for, you know, 30 creatures. Um, and that was kind of it. The Another thing that I is generally formats I like provide you with cards that work in any deck, and then it's on you to sort of build the, you know what I mean? Like it's really more on the gameplay. Like I don't love the deck building and drafting element of these type of formats where it's more about like, okay, well, you have to draft this card in this spot because it's better in your deck than just taking the best card early. I just kind of like to. I'm kind of somebody that likes to go into a draft and be like, okay, well, these cards are good, these cards aren't, and obviously there's still some of that in this format. And then it's like, what can you do with that information? Whereas in this format, to me, it kind of feels like sometimes it's like, okay, well, you found your lane, and then, oh well, the color you're in was open, or the color pair that you're in is open, but the cards that you open in the color, like if you're trying to do speed stuff, start your engine stuff, and you're in white black, and you're drafting that or whatever because that's what's open, and you just don't see enough start your engines cards, but you see other black cards, your deck just isn't going to be that good. But like it's not necessarily your fault because early in like pack one you saw a decent number of them, and then in pack three it's like, well, they just didn't open as many. You know what I mean? Or you didn't open as many artifacts, or you didn't open as many whatever. In pod, that kind of solves itself. On the ladder, it doesn't. Um, and it's just there just was. I feel like there was not as much synergy overlap as I like. I kind of like when the cards have multiple spots. I like when the cards fit sort of seamlessly. Again, a good example of a format that I really like that not everybody loves is Merge at Carla Manor, where it really was just like, okay, your card does these things. Your card, like the mechanic is you make clue tokens. Clue tokens, 2 mana draw a card. That's it. They don't like there's no like inherent synergy there. There's not really artifact synergies. There was blue red, but that was one deck. A lot of times it was just like, oh, you're gonna, make clue tokens and draw cards, and that's how you're gonna like your thing is you get extra cards when you use these cards. This set, it's like, well, this set, it's like, okay, well, if you get to max speed, then you do something and whatever, and you need to have all these enablers for speed, and you have to have the right number of things to actually get damage through, and you need to have the right number of payoffs, and it kind of you need to draw well and whatever. It just kind of fell to more swingy like that to me. Um, it's another format where I feel like if I just had somebody else draft the decks for me, it would be a lot easier. There are not a ton of formats like this where it's um, if you just hand me a better player than me's deck and say, okay, well, here's what they drafted, go make it work. Obviously, that for me is I think a lot easier than uh drafting the deck yourself and then having to make it work, right? Because a lot of the skill is kind of finding those things in draft that you know how to like build like the deck well and whatnot. And it's something that I've just never been amazing at because I don't really have a great feel for it. I don't have as good of a feel for it as I do game states on the board usually. So when a format becomes about that, which this one very much was, I tend to my results tend to suffer from that. High level competition in this format. We did okay in the open. We ended up going 4-2. Whatever. There was a debacle with my draft two, one of my matches there. That was a disaster. But I think I was fine. I just the arena open didn't go great for me. We did get to day two, but it was whatever. So that was the first one I haven't cashed in quite a while. So it was bound to happen at some point. But that's obviously going to cloud your judgment on a format is how well you do in the high stakes events as well. All right, that's it. That's enough of my rant. There were some good things about this format. I guess I can say highlight some interesting stuff. I think exhaust was interesting. The fact that they managed to make it work is interesting. Uh, it's like to me, exhaust is like everything I love about incubate kind of exists with exhaust, but it's instead of it being about on the board stuff, it's like nope, this is card advantage stuff. In most cases, it was grow your creature, or it was draw a card, or it was put 2 lands into play, or whatever, which is just draw cards. A lot of the exhaust stuff was about going big, whereas incubate, my favorite, I think my favorite limited mechanic ever. I think it's my favorite limited mechanic ever is incubate. Um, was all about, hey, you make this thing on the board. You can choose to flip it now. You can choose to flip it later. It has like semi haste when you flip it. It's all about like your opponent knows it's there, and it's not gonna end the game, right? It's not gonna like you're not gonna just snowball and end the game with incubate tokens. You're just gonna kind of have a little incremental advantage and move on, which is kind of how I like to play. Which is exhaust is kind of like, well, you did your like mini combo with exhaust, and now you've snowballed and the game just ends, which is an experience that I didn't love. But yeah, exhaust I think was a success in terms of I think what their goals were. Their goals were probably to make a mechanic that was a little over the top and whatever. I know people have been telling them to slow the games down for a while. Um, this isn't the way I would have gone about doing that, but it is what happened. And yeah, that's it. It's a the good news is right. We're gonna have more formats at a rapid pace coming in the future. So whether you like the format or you don't, there's gonna be fresh stuff coming out not too far away. And with that, I'm gonna be sending off Aetherdrift. I'll be back for my set review with Dragonstorm, which I think will be out in a couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks. So stay tuned for that, and I will see you next time.